Hello and welcome to the Cut and the Dry here on the Life Given Radio. This is the show that doesn't mince the hot takes that the Bible lays out for us, cut and dried. I'm your host, Kip and I'm here with my co-host, Isaac Lopez. How's it going, man?
It's going really well. First recording of the new year.
Heck yeah.
Let's get it rolling.
Yeah. We recorded the special on wealth a couple days before Christmas, but we haven't done anything since then. So
No, we were on break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been good. Christmas was amazing.
Oh yeah.
New Year's was a lot of stuff's happened.
Yeah, a lot of stuff.
I kind of skipped reading the news for a couple months there, and then everything happened at the Capitol and Trump conceded, and I was like, wow, I didn't really want to read the news.
Yeah, no, it's not a great place to be reading, but it's still. We're gonna get to that.
Yeah. Actually, one quick thing before we get into Indubitable. Ever since I got off social media, I was kind of not really sure where I was going to get news from.
Right.
Because, Apple News and Google News aren't really, they're not great. There is an app that you can get on at least the Apple App Store. That's just called Conservative News, and it has things like Breitbart, The Blaze, Daily Wire,
gotcha.
all of this stuff, and it's all in one place, and it's like read-only view.
Wow.
And
cool.
It's super nice for just like a clean view of the news without anything else.
Very interesting.
It does have like banner ads that you can get rid of for a one-time purchase.
Okay.
But I've found that super helpful because it's just like a place that I can go read the news without.
Sweet. Make sure to link to that then in the description because that's a great recommend. And it's not even our toilet tip yet.
That is a
You're
bonus
on a roll.
Toilet tip.
That is a bonus one. That's fantastic.
Well, with that, welcome back to 2021. This one's going to be a juicy one, boys. But let's get right into Indubitable. And we're kicking off the year with a bit of a spicy one, which is white privilege.
Oof.
So
doesn't get better than that.
Early on in our show, we discussed a quote from Timothy Keller where he mentioned that being white was worth around $1 million over the course of a lifetime. And some of you may remember me saying $1 million over a lifetime isn't that much, really.
Right.
And probably thought, geez, Kip, your white privilege is showing there, bud. So here's my response to that overt display of my white privilege. So what? I don't care. And I do have reasons for that, which I'm going to get into. In postmodern times, there's such an ingrained evil connotation with white privilege that instead of redefining a phrase invented by the secularists, I think our response ought to be, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you have to say. My definitions are based on what the creator of all things has to say, and you're just some idiot. So here's what the creator of all things has to say about white privilege. There are a few things I want to highlight. First, everything we have is a gift. James 1:17 says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Second, we ought to be grateful for all of the things given to us by God. I'm kind of setting up an argument. Some of you will have caught on to this by now, but we ought to be grateful for all the things given to us by God is the second point. The first point is that everything we have is a gift. So you probably already see where I'm going with this. And I don't really need to tell you that the Bible tells us to be thankful for all things. It's a recurring theme throughout every word of the scriptures. But here's just one that I love. 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. The assumption here is that you ought to be grateful for all things. You don't get to be ungrateful for the fact that you're white and privileged. That's not a virtue.
Right.
That's a sin. And Ecclesiastes makes this even more clear in chapter 5, verse 19. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. It doesn't get much more clear than that. And obviously the term white privilege doesn't show up in scripture, but I think you get where I'm going with this. Everything we have is a gift, and Ecclesiastes even brings it down to the point of wealth, that we ought to be grateful for that specific gift. There is no exception. You don't get to make exceptions for things that you think are unfair to black people or Mexicans, because on a whole, they don't have the same level of wealth that white people do. You don't get to be ungrateful for a gift just because somebody else doesn't have it.
Right.
That's not how it works. But here's where it really comes to a head. We ought to serve those around us with the gifts we have been given. 1 Peter 4:10 says, "As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace." I think this really hits the nail on the head, because Peter's telling us God doesn't give everybody the same gifts. As good stewards of God's varied grace, we ought to use the fact that, obviously not every white person is wealthier than every black person or Mexican. That's obviously not the case. And Isaac's over here half Mexican, so this is probably uncomfortable. But the point is, be grateful for the gift you've been given. If you have indeed been given the gift of white privilege, be grateful for it. Don't be ungrateful for it by spurning it as some sort of evil thing. It's not an evil thing. It's a gift from God. And second of all, you have this gift from God, so use it to serve those around you. And I think that's the perspective that Christians need to have when it comes to white privilege. Do you have any thoughts there, Isaac? I see you ruminating over there.
Yeah, I am ruminating. I think it's very interesting, because I think that overall your perspective is the correct one, with understanding that you're born, you can't control the color of your skin, you can't control your sex, you can't control all of these things. Like everything that you are, God has gifted you with. Right. Now, when it comes to the term white privilege, there's so much negative connotation around that, that I actually want to haggle over the terms, because when it comes to what the culture is saying is white privilege, and that white people have this inherent easy step in life, when I would disagree with that. I would disagree with the culture's definition.
You would disagree with even the assumption that white people
have a certain privilege. I think that we've moved well beyond the tragedy of the Civil War in our country. And what was on stage was the racism in America, right? I mean, there was racism that I think our countries had to deal with, but I think you're not going to run into a lot of people today that are going to be like, "Oh, you're black, so I'm not going to hire you." Like that person is in the wrong, right? So I actually would like to wrestle with their definition at some point, because I think it's very flawed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, and I think the only point where there's, I think where I'd agree with you is that there is no opportunity privilege for white people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't think that black people or Mexicans are denied opportunities because of their skin color, right? And so in that sense, I think that there is no such thing as white privilege. The only point where there's even kind of a hint of white privilege being a real thing is just in the average wealth demographics of different races per se. Different skin colors. White people are on average wealthier than black people, but Jews are wealthier than the average Caucasian. And you don't see anybody complaining about that.
Yeah, and so, I mean, not to get too deep into this, but like I've looked at some of the studies, and more like the crime rates in different parts of the U.S. Like why are African Americans being arrested at higher rates than white people? Like proportionally to the amount of those people in the United States, right? Yeah. And I think that's more chalked up to the culture that they're growing up in. Where are you being raised? And once again, that's a gift of where God has placed you.
Exactly. That is another huge factor. There are so many factors around this. I'm only going to touch on one more just to kind of kickstart y'all's thought process on this. The one other factor is average IQ. And what's interesting is white people do have a higher average IQ than black people, for example, but they have a lower average IQ than Asians. and
Right.
a lower average IQ than Jews. So there's, I mean, white people on a whole are kind of just thrown in the middle.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
in terms of what you would consider to be privilege.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your intelligence, average wealth, opportunity, things like that. Culture, another big
Right.
one.
Right.
And so, as you're thinking about this, do realize that it's not like this pyramid with white people at the top of the privilege chain. There's a lot more to consider, and there are certain other cultures that are more privileged in areas, particularly in intelligence.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cultures that are ahead in that respect. So all that to say, there's a lot to think about here, and the bottom line is just be grateful for where you're at.
Yeah.
And use your gifts to serve God and those around you.
Right, and like that's like this is the last thing I'll chime in on. Okay. There's so much to unpack here, and like obviously, the people who are listening, they may be like, oh, but Kip or Isaac said this, and it's like we're just discussing very rapidly a very big topic. But I looked up just the definition of privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. And if we truly believe that God has created each individual person's with different gifts and abilities, we're all privileged. You know, I mean, there are just going to be different sets of people, or just different specific people that have. Yeah, I mean, and to a degree, that's true. I mean, we are all specially created in the eyes of God, and so we all have privilege. I mean, what our culture is so. Our culture is inherently selfish and greedy, and they want what other people have.
Right.
When really, you just need to go work your butt off. And if you want something, go after and pursue it by all fair means necessary. Right. Instead of being jealous and sitting on your butt all day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a great wrap up to this segment. We would love to talk about this more, guys, but we really got to move on. We're excited about our 4 cents.
Yes.
We're going to be talking a little bit about subsistence farming and homesteading.
What?
And the bones I have to pick with the people that are running in this crowd and jumping on this bandwagon.
Right.
Because I think I've noticed. Sorry, if I wasn't clear, we have officially jumped into our 4 cents.
I think they were catching up.
Okay.
I was still catching up, but
so our 4 cents. We're talking about homesteading and subsistence farming, and I think that there's a lot of thought that needs to go into this topic that isn't going into this topic. People are just kind of jumping on the train and riding it, and they don't really know what is going on.
Right.
So as we were prepping, Isaac mentioned I should probably define my terms a little bit. So
because I will just jump in. When Kip sent me the initial show notes or the outline, I'm like, this is actually the first time I feel like I've heard this term in a long time. And it's something that Kip has been wrestling with this past year.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah, so that, and I think it is smart that I should define terms, because there is a radical difference between homesteading and subsistence farming. So I'll start with homesteading. Homesteading is the concept that you raise animals or food in the form of vegetables on your own land, and you provide some of the food necessary to feed your family on the property that you own. Homesteading is super cool.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Siri doesn't understand what I'm saying. So that's pretty awkward.
that is perfect. If only he had jumped in like at the very beginning of our 4 cents, then you could have just said, oh yeah, I need to talk about that. Hey, and let the record state that it wasn't my phone that vibrated this time.
It's fair. All right, we're even now.
We're even now.
My watch decided to pipe into this podcast. Big Brother is listening.
It's about time to go just 11th century, right?
So the concept of homesteading is just that you raise some of the food necessary on your own property. Super cool concept. It allows you to have more natural, organic food. You know how it's been raised. You know what your cow has eaten.
Right.
So you can control flavor, nutrients that you're getting from the meat. You can control all of these variables that you just don't know when you're getting something shrink wrapped off the shelf at Winco, right? So super cool concept. That's homesteading. Subsistence farming is when you raise all of the food or gather or hunt for all of the food that you need to survive, and you have absolutely no connection to the outside world to get you things like power, propane, water, sewer service, any of that things. Everything that you need to survive in subsistence farming happens on your own property. And my major bone to pick, I'll just give you a little teaser, we've got a lot to say here, with the homesteading community, is that they have, in my mind, kind of blurred the line between these two things. They don't understand that homesteading, as they imagine it, is not sufficient to take care of their families if society collapses. They think that they're doing everything they need to survive without realizing, oh, they're still using a well that uses power that's provided by the city 5 miles away. They might have thought of this with a backup propane generator, but they don't realize that they're not going to be able to buy propane, and their generator is eventually going to break. So I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to read a couple passages before we get into what I've got to say. And the first passage is from Luke chapter 16. We talked about this in our special just recently, and I love Luke chapter 16. But verse 8 says, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light." And again in Matthew 10 verse 16, "I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." You're probably thinking, wow, you kind of started out with this whole farming thing, and then you read these two passages that have literally nothing to do with what you're saying.
We're going to talk about wealth again.
There is a very clear connection between these two verses and what I have to say. And I'm just going to try to highlight it in as clear of terms as I can. How can you be shrewd in your dealings with the world if you have no involvement with the world? How can you be shrewd in your dealing with mankind if all of your time is taken up by planting turnips and killing cows? That's the bottom line. And so there are two main issues that I'm going to draw from the modern homesteading movement that I think has really developed a lot in the last year in Christian circles. And just to give you a bit of context, I've been thinking about this for about 6 months because there's so much to unpack when it comes to preparing and the whole prepping, homesteading, subsistence farming movement. Because what I immediately realized as I started thinking about it is I could very easily spend all of my time setting me and my family up to survive without any modern luxuries, and not accomplish anything in the real world, and that's where my first problem comes up, and that's burying the talents. I know this parable has become kind of the anthem of this podcast, but I think there's good reason for that. We are living in a culture that not even just in secular culture, in Christian culture as well, that is so prone to burying their talents that it's really disturbing. And I think that this movement of homesteading / subsistence farming is in some cases a good example of this fault. And just like I said before, you cannot do what Matthew 10:16 tells us to do, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. We cannot deal with the world if we are out of this world, in the sense that everything that we need is provided by our land, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is not that providing for your family isn't important. It's obviously one of the most important things that a man must do. right? It is one of
Right.
the primary objectives of a husband and father's life. In fact, I mean, the Bible tells us if you don't do it, you have denied the faith and you're worse than an unbeliever. So
Right.
I think that it's understandable that men in times like this have so quickly gone to really prioritizing, well, how am I going to homestead and subsistence farm, right? Because the thought of not doing that should be terrifying to a Christian man, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a honorable reaction to rush into it.
Okay.
But I think that it's a little bit misguided. Okay. And the reason for that just is the fact that you ought to provide for your family first and foremost, physically, mentally, spiritually, in all ways. That is your primary goal. But that's not all. 99% of men are called to do more than that. We are called to expand the kingdom in more ways than just raising godly children.
Right.
And you can't do that if you're, farming your land 24 hours a day.
Right.
So I'll kind of leave it at that, because that's kind of the point I want to get across, is just that don't rush into it.
Okay.
And bury your talents before it's necessary. But at this point, you might be thinking, well, if I don't do it before it's necessary, I'm never going to be able to do it.
Right.
And I'll get to that later on. But the second problem I have with this homesteading, subsistence farming movement is more of a practical one. And this has just come from me thinking through it for the last 6 months and how I ought to be preparing for it. And this second problem is just a lack of practical knowledge as to how this is all going to shake down. And this gets back to what I was saying about there being kind of this blurring of the definitions between homesteading and subsistence farming. They're not the same thing. And people need to understand that they're not the same thing.
Right.
Because you can do homesteading in modern times and it's awesome. But you cannot homestead in a post-apocalyptic world and survive.
Right.
So you can't have things like, off-grid solar and windmills and propane generators and wells. Those things aren't going to work for very long.
Yeah.
Right? Even if you spent $250,000 on a solar panel array, a windmill, and a backup propane generator, eventually all of those things are going to break. And unless you happen to be an electrical engineer, a mechanical engineer, a farmer, a hunter, and all of those things, you're not going to be able to fix it, right? And you're not going to have the parts to fix it, even if you do have the knowledge to fix it. And so, as you see these guys starting to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing for the worst, just keep in mind that all they're doing is extending their luxuries for 5 to 10 years tops.
Okay.
And so, with that in mind, this concept of homesteading and self-sufficiency must always be tempered with the fact that at some point in a true societal collapse, all of those luxuries that you've built up for yourself that are sufficient apart from city service are going to fail. And you're going to find yourself very quickly in the 11th century.
Right.
And if you don't know how to live in the 11th century, well then, that $250,000 you spent is worthless. And so I think this is probably a good time for me to kind of transition, because I've kind of like hammered down on this and said this. I've just been bashing this. But I think that there is some wisdom to it. But I think that there's just more thought that needs to go into it.
Okay.
So here's how I think you ought to approach this type of preparation. First, be prepared to live in the 11th century and still provide as you ought to for your family.
Okay.
Because eventually you need to be prepared to find yourself in that scenario no matter what happens. There are, however, 2 ways that I think you can avoid getting to the 11th century.
Okay.
The first and primary way that you can avoid ending up living in the 11th century, where the only luxuries you have are a rain catchment system and a hole in the backyard to poop in. That's all you got, right? not that great. You know,
Right.
you don't want to be digging your poop out of a hole to fertilize your green beans. That's not a fun time.
No, but that is another good toilet tip just for down the road. You know, we're really starting to stockpile these. Hey, I'm just weaving this into a coherent story. I don't know, but
I mean, it is a very toilet tip.
it is.
So
it is.
There you have it.
That's what.
Sorry, I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
But the primary way that you could avoid ending up in that scenario where you are living in the 11th century is by building a network of family and trusted friends with differing assets and differing skill sets. And the reason I say this is that society develops through capitalism. We all know this. And if you don't know this, you're probably not listening to this podcast. So society develops through capitalism. And the only way that you're going to avoid losing all of the luxuries that make life easier is by surrounding yourself with people who can do different things. So you have a hunter, you have a gatherer, you
Right.
have a farmer, you have a mechanic, you have all of these, you have an engineer who can work on electricals. You have all of these different types of people that you can trust and trade with. But here's another caveat to this point. In order for this to work, you have to have a skill that you can trade back. Because if you've got nothing, your money's going to be worthless. So you do need to have some sort of practical skill that you can trade with other people
like
in this
podcasting.
scenario. Like podcast, that is a very practical skill. It's going to be very useful. So that's the primary thing I think you can do to avoid living in the 11th century. And let me just illustrate this by, let's think about the 11th century. The reason society didn't develop is because everybody was either a serf or a lord.
Right.
Right? And so you had a bunch of people who were subsistence farming and they didn't get anywhere.
Right.
Wow! Who'd have thunk? Capitalism is what pulled society out of that rut. And so if you can maintain capitalism, it follows that you can maintain, obviously on a smaller scale, but at least maintain some of the luxuries that have been developed over the last couple hundred years.
Right.
And then the final thing is just kind of a wisdom thing in terms of how much you can do. You know your own finances. You know what you can accomplish. But what I've tried to do is provide myself with a buffer by buying something like a generator and stuff like this that I can, have long shelf life food and water and a generator set aside so that it gives me time to build a rain catchment system or something like that. The things that you do need to survive in the case that society does collapse. Like if I lose city water to my house, I know what I need to do.
Right.
I just need some time to do it. But that allows you to not waste your time now, not bury your talent now by building a rain catchment system. If you have a way of maintaining survivability once society does collapse, if that makes sense.
Right.
So it gives you a buffer of, okay, I can provide for a year or 2 years without all of these fancy prepper things.
Right.
But it gives me the time to do that if the need arises. And so I think that's probably, and again, I haven't heard anybody else say this, so take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
This is just my 4 cents.
Yeah.
My 2 cents. Isaac hasn't even chimed in. I think the wisest way to approach it is to buy the stuff that will give you a buffer. And once that buffer's in place, just know that this is what I have to do if society collapses and I need to prepare. So what are your thoughts on that, Isaac?
Well, gosh, Kip. It was just very fascinating to listen to that. I mean, once again, I'm kind of like in the seat of the listener of like I didn't really know much about this, right? Or like I hadn't pondered it much because I've done certain things where you have to provide for yourself out in the wilderness like that.
Yeah.
That's I've been in some of those situations. I mean, they're not like crucial situations, but anyway, I guess I just have a few questions that if we can kick around.
Go for it.
And just like the probably big picture, I mean, I think you are the only one talking about subsistence farming, at least in our network.
Sure.
I know I hadn't really considered it after 2020, but I know that there's plenty of people that have their finger on the pulse and like thinking this is more of a reality than it was just a few years ago of people need to have those skills. How much though, just looking at big picture, how likely do you think it will be that there's a total collapse in society and you have to fend for yourself like this?
Yeah, I think it's very slim.
Okay.
I think homesteading is always a good idea because we're already seeing things like supply chain issues.
Right.
Like fast food restaurants aren't serving certain things because they can't get them. Every once in a while you'll walk into Winco or Walmart and they just don't have something.
Right.
It's weird. So we're already seeing, supply chain issues.
Okay.
And I think that type of thing getting worse is very likely.
Okay. Gotcha.
And so I think that the concept of homesteading is a great idea. Even if you only have a little bit of land, if you can raise some of the food you need or know somebody who has some land that you can buy a cow and keep on their land, I think that's a great idea. And I love that concept. The idea of subsistence farming, however, the reason I've given myself a buffer rather than actually preparing all of the things that I would need to survive is because that I don't think it's very likely.
Okay.
So if I thought it was more likely, I probably would have put a little bit of time into this stuff ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
Because there are certain things that I could do without taking up all of my productive time,
Right.
And I've chosen not to. I'm hopeful and prayerful that this isn't something that's in our future or in our children's future, but I do think it's important to think about because it has become more of a likelihood over the last year than it was previously.
Yeah.
So I can't really give much more than that.
No, that's good. I was just, I could just kind of feel the slight panic in some of the people listening to this, like, oh, this, when you start listening to something, it's just makes it more of a reality because you start thinking about it, right? I mean, just that alone. But
don't panic.
Right? Yeah.
Think about it, but don't panic.
Right. Obviously, let the cooler heads prevail. I guess my next question is, you talked about networking with friends and family that have skills that vary from your own, and that you could kind of build that small capitalistic society, just like from the bare bones. But just thinking practically here in Moscow, we're a small rural town, but there are quite a few college students. There are a lot of people that live in town, not out of town. I don't know a ton of farmers. I mean, I'm aware of plenty of them, right? I know that some attend the church that I go to and some attend the church you go to. But how practical is it to network with people that aren't naturally in your friend groups, or when they're living in a town? How much should you go out of your way to start networking with people that have those skills when it comes to farming, when it comes to hunting? How much should that be on top of people? Like, where should it be on people's priority lists right now? Because you did say it's slim, but we still want to prepare for the future. So how would you go about kind of starting to build that network now?
Oh, great question. I'll start with the prioritization.
Okay.
I would just let it fit into your natural daily life, because as a guy, you're in the workplace, and you naturally are going to meet people who do different things. Now, depending on what type of work you're in, you're probably more likely to meet people who are farmers, or I mean, I'm in real estate, so I meet people who have land all the time. So it's kind of a natural thing for me. But if you're if you're a programmer, you're not likely to meet the type of people who are on first glance as valuable in terms of their skill sets in the apocalypse, right? But that's not necessarily the case, because if you do have solar panels, there are circuit boards.
Right.
They'll know how to work with those.
Yeah.
So I would just say let it just kind of sit there on the back burner in your mind, and don't make it awkward. Don't say, hey, so I just
If the world's ending.
but if the world's ending, can I buy some of your land? With the dollars that mean nothing anymore.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so with I didn't want to cut off
Yeah,
you
no, go
from
for
your
it.
answer there, but money, or rather a better way of saying it, exchange of goods that have value.
Yeah.
What do you think would be the best thing in trading for a small society? Is it just this is the need that you have and I can fill it if you fill this need that I have?
Yeah.
Do you think that it would fall all the way back to that? Or do you think we'd have some kind of monetary exchange, like a dollar bill?
I think in that scenario, any type of monetary exchange would probably actually be in precious metals.
Okay, gotcha.
And anything, but I should back up a little bit. In this type of scenario, what's going to be in high demand is farming.
Right.
Because not that long ago, most of America was farming. Right. And it's only because of modern technology and combines that are 50 feet wide that it's now only like 2% of America is farmers.
Yeah.
Right. But farming, when you lose those combines, is going to be a manual labor task.
Right.
And so I think most people will find themselves doing manual labor for farming. And there are going to be a few people who have skill sets that are still somehow valuable that can trade those skills to receive food from the farmers. So I think that'll be the primary thing. And then there will be some people who have, precious metals who can trade those with other people.
Right.
But I don't think that will be as valuable in a total collapse as just trading food and other necessities. So, but the other thing to keep in mind is if you're listening to this and thinking, oh man, I don't have any skill sets that would be valuable in the apocalypse, you can labor.
Right.
You can dig and play it. And that's just fine. That's going to be the most important thing. And it puts you directly connected to the supply of the most valuable asset.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with being a day laborer farming.
Right.
So
Now, if people want to be more than a day laborer, if they are looking at their skill set right now, it's like I am just a programmer, and that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 8-10 years. What would you say they should do to maybe start? You've got that buffer time, right, to start learning skills. Where should they go to first?
I would say just try to. I would try to, again, kind of the whole theme behind what I'm saying is I'm not encouraging you to put like 20% of your time towards preparing. I'm just encouraging you to let it sit there in the back of your mind and think about it. So with that in mind, I don't want you to, purposefully go out and network with people who have the skill sets you think you would need to trade with in the apocalypse. I'm not encouraging you to do that. And neither would I necessarily encourage you to specifically pursue another skill set just for the apocalypse.
Right.
I would just encourage you to think about what your current skill sets could translate into in the apocalypse. So whether, if you're a programmer, maybe you know a little bit about electrical work, and you could think about the things that are most likely going to be necessary in that time, like the basic Arduino chips that run modern generators and all those kind of things. You are probably more likely to be effective at working on that kind of stuff, right?
Okay.
So I would just try to think about, okay, what would I be good at, and then just don't necessarily spend too much time on it, but just give it a little think.
Okay.
And I think most of us will have something that kind of clicks into place that, this would make sense. And then you don't really need to think about it anymore. Unless everything collapses.
Right. just in case.
Just in case.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I had for you.
Awesome. Well, let's move straight into toilet talk. My tip is tied in with our 4 cents. It's very brief. I have not actually read all the way through this book yet, but it's right in line with what we discussed today. So my tip is read The Lost Ways by Claude Davis. This is a book that is written to teach you how to live in the 11th century. Kind of like what I was talking about. Be prepared to live in the 11th century and still provide as you ought.
Right.
This book will give you a lot of insight into how to do that.
Yeah.
And it's a fun read. It's fun to think about. Like,
Totally.
I enjoy this
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, and I think most guys enjoy this kind of stuff. They
Yeah.
enjoy the thought of, oh wow, that plant I saw is actually useful for this or whatever.
Right.
So,
Right.
It's a fun read, and also I think it would be really valuable for you. So that's my tip.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I will probably pick that up, maybe even borrow it from you when you're done, because I'm a cheapskate. But my tip is kind of more just like perspective. We were discussing early on in the show, I think, is having that a perspective when it comes to the culture. And maybe we didn't even talk about that, and I'm just misremembering that is true. But remember who the real enemy is. I think it's really easy. Well, first of all, this isn't necessarily a call for pacifism. I do want to put that out there because it might sound like that as I'm just walking through it, because we live in a very militant culture that I think requires a lot of
Cool-headedness.
But also I think a lot of people now are really gearing up for like that, for hot-headedness actually, and like really engaging with the culture and taking it head on, which is good. But I just want to remind you, this is a call for seeing the forest in the trees. Like don't lose sight of the bigger picture and just focused on the one stick that's right in front of you. Often we can become so singularly focused on one particular person or issue in our lives that we forget that there's a greater context. And that greater context is that we have already won the war in the cross, right? So Christ has already come. He's already defeated everything, right? We obviously have the day-to-day battles, and in those specific battles, it's really easy to forget that we've already won, and we can be more prone to knee-jerk reactions than actually just thinking, oh, maybe patience is a better virtue to exhibit here, instead of trying to beat this person over the head with the truth. And realizing sometimes love is required to be patient, right? It's required to be kind. And that, once again, not a call for pacifism and weak will, but rather let the cooler heads prevail in some situations. And really, the perfect combination is cooler heads with hearts full of courage. So we know when it's time to gird up and go to battle. Yeah.
That was beautifully put. And just to note here, this is disappointingly something that I've seen the left being far better at in the culture wars that are going on right now. The left is very good at in the governmental level, not in the Portland riots level. Is very good at appearing to be the cool-headed ones. And you see this with what just happened a couple days ago. I guess more like a week ago now, as you're hearing this. But Pelosi and Schumer are so good at painting Trump as this riot-inciting, crazy, wild man, when in reality that's not the case.
It isn't. No.
But they're so good at appearing like the calm, cool, level-headed ones, when in reality we all know they're completely bonkers. But just think about that. Be ashamed and don't be that way. So great tip, Isaac. Thank you. But before we sign off, if you've listened to us for this long, I hope you're interested in what we've had to say. So if you are, please feel free to share this show with your friends and give us a follow wherever you get your podcasts. Join our Discord channel to chat with us about these things. And with that, for the Cut and the Dry on the Life Given Radio, this is Kip and Isaac signing off.